Welcome to the Global Development Review podcast. It is an initiative of the Global Development Review Think Lab, and today we are pleased to host Professor Tariq Modood, a leading thinker and scholar in contemporary debates on multiculturalism, race and governance of diversity. Professor Tariq Modood is a professor of sociology, politics and public policy at the University of Bristol, where he also founded the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Citizenship. His work has profoundly shaped discussion on racial equality, religious identity, and how democratic societies can navigate cultural diversity while maintaining social cohesion. As an eminent scholar, Professor Tariq Modood has authored several influential books, including Multiculturalism, a Civic idea, and a book entitled Multicultural Politics, Racism, Ethnicity, and Muslims in Britain. His latest work, The New Governance of Religious Diversity, published in 2024, offers fresh insights into how societies manage religious diversity in an era of rapid global change. He was also the principal researcher for the landmark 4th National Survey of Ethnic Minorities in Britain, a study that continues to inform policy and academic discourse on race and integration. For his contribution to social science, Professor Tariq Modood was appointed a member of the Order of British Empire in 2001 and elected as Fellow of the British Academy in 2017. In this episode, we will explore some of the most pressing challenges facing Western societies and democracies. We'll discuss about different forms of Islamophobia and how do Muslims in the West experience it in their daily lives. Is Islamophobia increasing or declining in today's socio-cultural climate? Can moderate secularism help address religious discrimination? And with the rise of nationalism and populism, is multiculturalism under threat? Join us for this thought-provoking discussion on the complexities and possibilities of living together in difference. And I welcome Professor Tariq Modood to Global Development Review Think Lab, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. Professor Tariq, thank you very much for joining Global Development Review podcast, and it's really a pleasure to have you here. And I'm very delighted and excited to learn from your insights. And it's a very important topic that we are going to discuss today, given the current socio-political situation in the Western world. So thanks a lot for joining us. Before we just go into the depth of the topic and other issues of governance of diversity, I really want to understand from you actually the meaning of Islamophobia, so that our audience can also better understand that, what do we mean by Islamophobia, and actually what are the different forms of Islamophobia, and is it happening in the West, and how do Muslims in the West and also across the world are navigating Islamophobia in their daily lives?
I think that Islamophobia today has to be very much understood as a form of racism. Now, racism doesn't mean that it's to do with biology or just physical appearance or our genetics or anything like that. I think we have a concept of racialization in contemporary social science, where racialization is where one group, usually a dominant group, though it doesn't have to be, one group others another group and says, you are a group and you have some characteristics, and those characteristics make you in some ways inferior or backward. And because it doesn't have to be just biology, and in the case of Islamophobia, it certainly isn't, just as it isn't in the case of anti-Semitism, though there was a period when anti-Semitism was biological, for instance, in the Nazi theories. So I call this cultural racism because it's identifying a group in terms of its cultural characteristics or perceived cultural characteristics. As for what form it takes, it really takes a lot of different forms, and that's very important to understand the range. So if you think of, for instance, the Crusades, they were built on an animus and a hostility against Muslims and Islam as a kind of imposter religion or a heresy, and of winning back the Holy Lands from these impostors, from these heretics. We had something similar when Muslims in Spain, after the Reconquista, were subjected to various forms of inquisition or surveillance, and were both forced to convert and denounced as not real Christians because they didn't believe the right thing, or actually because Islam was in their blood. So the Spanish actually came up with the concept of la raza, race, and Muslims and Jews were the first targets of that concept in the 15th and 16th centuries. More closer to our own times, think about ethnic cleansing in Bosnia-Herzegovina. When Yugoslavia broke up, Serb militias attacked Bosnian villages and towns and Sarajevo. And when they attacked these villages and towns, they rounded up the men. They also rounded up the women and sent them on buses somewhere, but they rounded up the men and put them in detention camps. Often they killed them all. But they thought they were killing Muslims. So how did they know who was a Muslim? They didn't ask anyone, what do you believe? Do you go to the mosque? They assumed they were Muslims because they were part of that community, those families with that ancestry. They didn't ask them to recite any verses from the Quran. And then think of something like today. I've been involved in projects where this one was with the BBC actually, so it got a big publicity. We drew up two more or less identical CVs, job CVs, and we sent them to some real job vacancies, though the CVs were fictitious. And the job vacancies were for lower to middle management roles in IT in London. And we sent them to 100, each CV, but separately, of course, separately. And on one CV, we put the name Adam something, and on the other, we put the name Muhammad something. And the CV with Adam on it got invited to 12 interviews out of 100 applications. But Muhammad only got invited to 4, only a third. Well, that's a discrimination that's just based on a Muslim name. So that too is Islamophobia. But notice the differences between the different cases. Some of them are to do with Islam, and some of them are to do with Muslims. And so the term Islamophobia is a little bit misleading because it makes you think that what's being attacked is Islam, and it may not be. It wasn't really in Bosnia because they didn't say, oh, we're only going to kill faithful, believing Muslims. They wanted to wipe out the Muslim population from those territories, ethnic cleansing. So that's what I mean when I say some of them target Islam, like the Crusades. They said, you are heretics. So they were highly motivated by what these people, Muslims, but what these people believed. In Bosnia, they weren't interested in belief. And in the case of the interviews, the CVs that I mentioned, they don't know what the man who sent a CV called Muhammad or the man called Adam, what they believe. So we have to have a wide concept of Islamophobia that can both pick up hostility and discrimination because of a belief, because of the faith, or just because you are a member of a particular community. You have a certain ancestry, and both other Muslims, but sometimes to do with belief, sometimes the belief is not involved. So that's why it's very important to not end up with a concept of Islamophobia that's just about one thing or just about the other thing, just about Islam or just about Muslims. We need one that covers them both. And there will be some cases where the two are actually involved as well. I've just chosen extreme cases to show you the range. So that's Islamophobia for me. And I think that it is a very prevalent racism, cultural racism in Europe today.
Is Islamophobia increasing in the West, given the current socio-political situation? We have war going on in Palestine, and there are protests, and there have been across social media we see a lot of Islamophobic remarks by different groups, and also there are remarks for other communities as well. I'm asking this because I wanted to understand that how these factors like political shifts, political issues, or international conflicts, or cultural influence, or cultural integration influence, all these issues, how it impacts and this trend of Islamophobia, and how it also impacts the societies and perception in the West, especially when it comes to Islam and Muslims.
Unfortunately, I think Islamophobia is definitely increasing. That's pretty clear. We've seen an increase in the last few years, the last couple of years, very much for some of the reasons that you mentioned, like the war or the slaughter in Gaza. But it's been increasing over a longer period as well. So it's not just something to do with the recent events in Palestine. It can spike and then come down a bit and then spike again. But on the whole, the trend is upwards. So even if it spikes a bit or a lot and it comes down later, it doesn't necessarily come down to where it was before. So we both have an upward trend and we have an upward trend, but it's irregular. And it's very strongly linked to what one might call political controversies, and especially political controversies involving violence. So I think one of the first bursts of it was to do with the controversy over the novel, The Satanic Verses, in 1988, 89, 1990, in that period. And then there have been others similar to do with the Danish cartoons. Charlie Hebdo, of course, the killings of the staff in the Charlie Hebdo office. Other kinds of security issues. I mean, 9/11, of course, how can I miss out 9/11? That was a very big international spike. And more than a spike, it was really took it to a new level and kept it at that level, as it were. And so there are other issues that don't involve violence or security. And probably the single biggest is to do with women's dress, with the headscarf, the hijab, or the face covering, the niqab. Of course, as we know, especially in France, that has been really a great point of generating Islamophobia, but probably in all countries, including Britain, though in Britain perhaps not quite so much, and certainly our main political parties haven't suggested that either the hijab or the niqab should be banned anywhere, whether in schools or universities or civil service or in the law courts or in the army and so on. We have Muslim women wearing hijabs in all those places. So it definitely is on the rise, and it is actually there are two ways in which its rise is countering another trend. And this is the trend where we see, at least in Britain, I imagine something similar is true in most Western European countries, but I don't know the data so well, so I'll say about Britain. We see, from all the time the data has been collected, we see a decline in racism, what we might call color racism, against Black people, against brown people. We see a decline. And the decline is very much related to age. So younger people are less likely to have racist attitudes, at least according to themselves, these based on survey data, are less likely to have racist attitudes than older people. And that's quite a long-term trend. I would say it's a trend of at least 3, 4, 5 decades. And Islamophobia is rising, as we've just been saying. So that's one major counter trend. We have a decline in racism, but an upward movement of Islamophobia at the same time. So it's not what you'd normally expect, because most exclusionary attitudes towards marginal groups has actually been declining, whether it's marginal groups defined by race and ethnicity, or sexual minorities, or perhaps in some other ways. So that's the general trend, but Islamophobia, as I say, is the other way around. So that's one unhappy counter trend for Islamophobia. But the other unhappy trend is actually more recent, and that is that younger people continue to be less racist than older people, but some younger people, and in particular young men in Britain, and I know this is true in Western Europe, are now very hostile to Muslims. So that's another counter trend, though it's a more recent one, and perhaps it may not be so long lasting, though, it could be. I'm not saying it won't be, of course, I'm not saying it won't be. In fact, the way things are going at the moment, it's probably going to be around for a while. So that is obviously rather worrying. And I think that the way in Britain, especially in Germany and the United States, the way that expressions of Palestinian solidarity have been attacked as being racist, because we're told that to express solidarity for the slaughter and the suffering of Palestinians is somehow anti-Semitic. And especially in Germany and the United States, a lot of people are losing their jobs, including in academia, especially in academia. Public speakers are having invitations withdrawn, they're being cancelled, and so on for that reason. So that's clearly generating a new kind of Islamophobia in a place where, on the whole, we tend to have less racism, what we might call liberal institutions or educational and cultural institutions. But it's definitely having an effect on politics. We see that the vote for the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, the vote for other right-wing parties, including, of course, in the Netherlands, you have right-wing parties. It's quite well established. In fact, Netherlands in some ways led the trend in a kind of anti-Islamic politics, but it's now very strong in a number of Western European countries. In Britain, we do have a right-wing party called Reform, fairly recently formed. I mean, we have some really far-right groups as well, who are violent as well. And they can generate a lot of support with each other through social media, which is a powerful, powerful factor in poisoning people's attitudes, partly on the basis of misinformation. but we are unfortunately beginning to see it in Britain, even in mainstream politics. So at our last election, which was in July 24, a number of candidates, Muslims, stood as independent Muslims. And their main issue that they stood on was solidarity with Palestine and stopping the sending arms and other kinds of support to Israel. And 5 of them got elected, which wasn't expected, but a lot of people from not just the right, but the center and even the left got angry with those MPs and accused them of being sectarian, meaning that they were somehow bringing religious division into society as if it didn't exist without their intervention. And I think that's actually Islamophobic. If Muslims stand up for causes that they believe in and they're told that they're being sectarian, that's Islamophobic. If we'd had some other candidates stand up for Ukraine when they thought that the mainstream parties were failing to do so, which of course they haven't been, but supposing that they had been, if the situations had been reversed between Gaza and Ukraine, I don't think they would have been called sectarian. Some of them may have been called, courageous individuals willing to take a stand and be an example to the mainstream parties. So I think castigating Muslims for standing up for Muslim causes, I mean, of course, you're allowed to criticize them. Obviously, that's just normal politics. But calling them sectarian, instead of just saying, look, we don't agree with you, you're quite wrong, and here's why, which obviously people do as well, but just to call them sectarian is very invidious, and it's undermining them by not arguing with them and not taking their politics seriously, but bringing in a anti-Muslim Islamophobic element.
You have written extensively on the concept of moderate secularism. So, I mean, I am a bit aware of it, but I really want my audience to also understand what is that concept and how this framework of moderate secularism practically can reduce Islamophobia, promote the inclusion of religious minorities in liberal democracies like the West.
Yeah, so my concept of moderate secularism emerged with my dissatisfaction with people, especially after the Salman Rushdie affair, the Satanic Verses affair in the late 1980s into the 1990s, when people said that some of the things that Muslims were saying and doing, and just generally to recognize Muslims as what we might call a constituent part of our society, and who had the right to organize themselves politically in the way that workers do, women do, Black people do, gay men and lesbian women, etc., do, that somehow that was a betrayal of some fundamental value of secularism. And that kind of worried me, because I thought of myself as someone who was committed to secularism insofar as it exists in Britain. So I thought, well, what is it that I'm committed to? What is it that actually exists in Britain, which I go along with, which I'm content with? And I thought, well, those people who say that secularism as it exists in Britain consists of a separation of church and state, I thought, well, how can they say that? Our head of state, our monarch, Queen Elizabeth, now King Charles, is the supreme governor of the Church of England. Bishops from the Church of England sit in our upper chamber, our upper legislative chamber, the House of Lords. We have the Church of England at the centre of some of our national ceremonies. Most recently, of course, the coronation of King Charles. So I thought, well, these people can't be right. And also, some people then said, oh, yes, but that's all symbolic. And I said, well, no, it's not. A quarter of our education budget, a quarter of the money that we pay through taxes for schools are spent on schools organized by religious organizations, principally the Anglican Church and the Catholic Church. So that's not just symbolic, that's a very big fiscal resource. So, and I'm content with that. I'm not against that. I think that's a good idea for a number of reasons. But it's what we have in Britain. So I said, well, look, I'm in favor of the secularism that we have in Britain, but it's not the secularism that the so-called secularists are talking about. So we need to conceptualize it differently. And so I conceptualized it as moderate secularism, because it is a form of secularism, in my opinion. It's not a theocracy, but it's a certain kind of secularism. One which doesn't require total separation, and one which values what religion or organized collective religion can contribute to society. So it doesn't see religion as something that's either a social problem or something that has to be privatized as some kind of spiritual inner matter. And I thought, well, that's how religion is in Britain. And most people are happy with that, but we are a secular country as well. So that's how I came up with the concept of moderate secularism, to try to more accurately theorize about the kind of state, religion, politics relationships that we have in Britain. And then the question arises, well, what about the minorities? Because up to now I've been talking about Christians, especially the Church of England. So I then said, well, actually, if we look at the way that moderate secularism has evolved over time, and it is quite a long period of time, the movement has been towards inclusivity. Because firstly, from just the Church of England, it expanded to include other Christian denominations, including the Catholic Church, which at one point was treated a bit like Muslims are treated today, as like an enemy within, as a population that was susceptible to being led or mobilized by a foreign power, a threatening power like Spain, France, in another context. So I said, if we look at moderate secularism over a period of time, and specifically the case of Britain, we see it broadening out from the Church of England to including other Christian denominations, and then the Jews. They've been included in quite a substantial way. And in our own time, we're seeing the inclusion, gradual, but nevertheless perceptible, inclusion of Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, and others. And so I said that moderate secularism has the potential, has the latent resource character to be multiculturalized, to be inclusive of minorities. I wasn't saying we'd reached that point either then or today. We haven't reached it, but we have actually been moving in that direction, which of course I'm pleased about. And I think we've, further direction to go. And I think we probably will carry on with this dynamic that I've described, the inclusive dynamic. And no Muslim has anything against the Church of England's public status. its privileged status in the state of the United Kingdom. The people who are most against it are secularists. Also, it's fair to say that some Christians are against it as well. Catholics aren't happy with it necessarily, but they're not very unhappy with it either. They don't talk about it a lot, but they believe in a universal church, so they don't want to have nationalized religions. Though, to be quite honest, while they believe that as a doctrine, the way the Catholic Church relates to the Spanish state, the Italian state, the French state, and so on, actually does recognize them as national communities. And therefore, to some extent, they're a bit more like moderate secularism as well. And so I said, this valuing of a public place for religion, seeing religion as potentially a public good, is a feature of contemporary Britain and is a basis for including minorities in an inclusive, egalitarian way, what I call multiculturalism or multiculturalizing moderate secularism.
So, I mean, you were talking about multiculturalism, and I was just wondering, like, given the current situation is in the West, the rising Islamophobic trend, is multiculturalism and as a governance model a threat? And just winding it up, like, how do you see the future of multiculturalism in the West, and what policy shifts are necessary actually in Western state for the governance of diversity? I mean, I was looking at your profile, and you have recently also published a book, I think, about governance of diversity. So I really would like to understand, like, the future, and also, like, so how it is going to be valid or accommodated in current situation.
Yes. So I certainly agree that multiculturalism is on the defensive because there has been a very significant backlash, or a number of different backlashes, and often actually targeting Muslims as a result of some of those triggers that I mentioned earlier, the political controversies, and obviously the international terrorism has not been good for the reputation of multiculturalism, even though international terrorism has nothing to do with multiculturalism at all. But nevertheless, it's made politicians reluctant, for instance, to even use the word multiculturalism in a positive way, in a favorable way. So I certainly appreciate that. I regret it, obviously. Some people then go a bit further and say that multiculturalism is dead. Other people say it's failed. So it's not just dead, but it deserved to die. It failed. Angela Merkel, I think, is one person, but not only Angela Merkel. Most of the Western political leadership have said that in one form or another. That's not true. It's not true in a number of ways. So firstly, if we say, well, what are multiculturalist policies? Policies to do with legal protection against discrimination, policies to do with institutional accommodation, like, for instance, accommodating turban-wearing Sikh men into the army or the police, or for that matter, in any workplace, and the same to do with Muslim women, or allowing people prayer space. And when I say people, I mean in particular Muslims, prayer space at work, widening the school curriculum. In all these respects, multicultural policies have not been reversed. So multiculturalism is not dead. The strongest case that you could say is that the momentum forward has stalled. It hasn't gone further forward, and we've got a kind of standing still position in terms of policies, but loads of negative rhetoric in terms of the political music. I think that's the strongest you could say. But even that's not quite right, because actually, going back to what I said, Latif, much earlier, about younger people tending to be less racist than older people in terms of their attitudes, though unfortunately some of them can still be Islamophobic. We see, in general, a lot of attitudes moving in a multiculturalist direction. Broadly speaking, whether they use the term multiculturalism or not, are broadly speaking what we would call pro-diversity. So I think that you could divide up the British population into roughly 3 blocks. We have a pro-diversity block, and at the other end, we have a anti-diversity block, what I'll call right-wing nationalism, monocultural populist nationalism, which is now so familiar to us. It's, they're winning elections or certainly making very big vote increases in elections. And then that leaves a third of people who are in the middle. They can be pulled either way because they have some sympathy with both sides, or a certain big event can push them into one side or another. Certain political controversies, and we do have some of those, and in particular controversies to do with violence and terrorism. They can easily move people rightwards. But on the other hand, you have quite a lot of political leadership or institutional leadership, let me call it, that is very open to multiculturalism in universities, in cultural institutions, theatres, art galleries, and even our monarchy. Our monarchy is very open to multiculturalism. King Charles, in his coronation, just before his coronation, he said that he wanted to be a defender of all faiths. That's not quite the words he used. I forget what words he used, but he didn't want to be a defender of a single faith. He wanted to be a champion, protector, promoter of all faiths in Britain. And at the ceremony, the coronation, which I thought was a very marvelous, splendid event, it was arranged to have a number of multiculturalist features. It had a black female bishop, it had a black gospel choir, and a leader from the Muslims, from the Jews, and from the Hindus. They welcomed King Charles at the end of the ceremony, and so on. So I don't think multiculturalism is dead, but clearly one can't feel relaxed about its future. One can't take anything for granted. There are some trends that are making us move more in a multiculturalist direction, and then there are some trends doing exactly the opposite. So a lot depends upon winning that third of people in the middle. And I think multiculturalists and pro-diversity people should make a bigger effort than they are doing currently in winning that third of people. Because if we lose them to the far right, that really will be a very heavy price we'll have to pay after that. So what should we be saying or doing in order to win those people in the middle? Well, I think there are certain things that the liberal left has championed, which is alienating that third of the people, let alone the extreme right third. One of, I think, too uncritical a view of immigration. A country should be able to decide whether it wants more immigrants, less immigrants, at a particular moment in time, depending on either its economic needs or its capacity to take on more people. At one time, it may have more capacity. At another time, it may have less, especially if there are some refugees, and we have had substantial refugees. And so we should at least distinguish between migrants who a country can say yes or no to, and refugees who really are desperate and who we have to give some shelter to, usually temporarily, but sometimes the wars or famines they're escaping from can be quite long-lasting as well. So I think we need to dissociate the idea of multiculturalism from a view that more immigration is better than less immigration. Secondly, I think that we need to connect multiculturalism with pride in our country. I think too many people think multiculturalism is an alternative to what we might call nationalism. And I say, no, it's not. It's obviously an alternative to right-wing nationalism, but many people are proud of their country or have a special attachment to it. It's an important part of their identity, just as their faith can be an important part of their identity, or their gender, or their race. So for a lot of people, actually most, some degree or other, most people have a sense of attachment to their country, and their identity is shaped by that feeling. And we should make that inclusive, because sometimes it can be very exclusive. That's why we have right-wing nationalism who say, right-wingers who say, this is our country, you are foreigners, you are unwanted, go away. No, the multiculturalism does the opposite. It says, this is our country, but it's the country of all of us. But we're not against our country. We want the best for our country. So I think in at least those two ways, namely being more moderate about immigration, moderate and pragmatic, not just assuming that more is always better than less, and that there can be stresses and strains for immigration. There obviously can be lots of benefits. I certainly wouldn't want to deny that, far from it. I'd want to emphasize the benefits, and in a way, if you like, I'm taking that for granted by then saying, yes, but there can be costs. There can be economic costs. There can be costs to the welfare services, to schools, to hospitals. But there can also be costs in terms of the damage it can do to a successful multiculturalism by generating hostilities, suspicions, and so on. So that's one point. And the other point is that we have to embrace the idea that our country can be an inclusive country, in fact, must be an inclusive country. So too many, I think, on the liberal left have another vision of multiculturalism, which is sometimes called cosmopolitanism. They see the whole world as the kind of locus of their sense of identity and, if you like, a certain kind of ethical citizenship. And that may be right. I mean, that may be important in some context. I certainly wouldn't want to do away with that. But it's not a substitute for, and it shouldn't be in competition with, our actual citizenship, which is national. Though with the European Union, that confuses things a little bit. Of course, we're no longer part of that. But anyway, in the main, the French, the German, the Dutch think of their citizenship in national terms. It's where they get most of their rights from, most of their public services and benefits from, most of their economic policies, which are made at national level, though not exclusively, for the European Union, and so on. But that, for me, is where I am at the moment, seeing an endangered multiculturalism, but by no means a defeated or a dead multiculturalism. I think there's everything to play for, but we need to win that third of people in the middle. We need to win them, especially in democratic elections, but we need to get them on our side, obviously, well in advance of any particular election date.
On that note, I would really like to end this, Professor Tariq, but I hope that I will also get more opportunities to learn from you. I was really enjoying the discussion, and such a depth of ideas and insights. So thank you so much for joining here, and I'm really looking forward to have more interactions with you. Thanks a lot.
Okay, inshallah. Thank you very much for the invitation.